Pack 12 is the final pack, and this begins with stage 66. With this stage you get the parts for the rear tie rod, so you get these two ball end screws and the three components for the tie rod. So the first thing to do is to make the tie rod up as you did in stage 42 and adjust this gap to measure 5.7 millimeters. Next, take the lower arm assemblies from stages 36 and 50 and then install the ball end screws into the top of the hub carrier. Next, tighten a ball headed screw into each of the upper holes on the rear suspension mount. And that's how the assembly should look with the two ball end screws in place. Next you can fit the ball end of the tie rods onto the ball screws on the mounts and just push those into place like that. You now need the two servos and the servo horns from stage 43 and 51, plus the screws and locking nuts from stage 49. You next need to remove the servo mount. So to do this you need to be taking out these four screws here and also the two screws on the opposite side of the upper plate. Next, take a servo and the steering servo horn, and you'll be fitting the horn in this position on the steering servo. You need to make sure that the servo is centered, and that means that the servo horn will turn just over 90 degrees in each direction. So you just fit that in there in the best place so that it will do that. So just take the horn and then just fit it with one of the screws supplied. Next, fit 4 of the 3x8mm screws into the servo itself, and then you can loosely fit a lock nut on the other side. Next, take the servo mount and the steering servo and place it into the slots on the mount and push it all the way in. So that the nuts fit inside the recess on the mount slots, like this. And this is the reason you needed to leave the nuts in a loose state. You also need to remove the fuel tank to access the screws on this side to tighten them up. You can also see here that a ball-headed screw has been fitted to the outer hole of the servo horn as well. With the fuel tank back in place and the steering servo securely fitted, you can then fit the throttle servo into this space here, and that just secures in with 4 of the 3x8mm screws only. There are no nuts to fit this, and they just fit into these 4 holes here. With the throttle servo fitted into place with the 4 bolts, you can then fit the throttle servo horn, and that's fitted in the same way as the steering servo. So this is the servo mount assembly with both servos in place. You next need to remove this cover from the receiver box and then pass through the 2 servo cables under this tab in the receiver box and through this hole so that they pull through like this. With the servo mount back in place, you need to make sure also that the servo wires haven't become crushed underneath the mount supports So just make sure these are routed properly through and next to the fuel tank, and they are still movable from this side as well. Next it's time to install the steering servo saver and its tie rod and shaft. So the first thing to do is to install this shaft into the chassis. Install the steering servo saver shaft onto this into this hole here by threading a screw from underneath, and then screwing the shaft down onto the chassis. Like this, and then tighten that up from the underside. Next you need to take the steering servo saver itself and fit in these 3 ball-headed screws into the holes, and then you need to find your steering tie rods from stage 42 with the 2 ball-headed screws as well. Tighten the 2 ball-headed screws into the holes in the front hub carriers, so it's one by there and one by there, so just tighten those right in. You can then fit the steering tie rods to the ball-headed screws on the hub carriers. So they just fit that underneath the upper arm first of all, and then just press down onto the ball-headed screw. I'm going to do the same for the other side. You can then take the servo saver and fit this over the shaft in this position, and then fit the steering tie rods over the 2 ball-headed screws on the steering saver. You can then take the steering saver tie rod and fit this between the ball-headed screw on the steering saver and the ball-headed screw on the steering servo. Next refit the upper plate that you removed earlier and secure that with the 2 screws that came off before. You can then refit the 4 screws securing the servo mount. You can then fit the remaining 3 screws for the upper plate. The 2 long ones will go in these sides and the shorter one will fit into the hole in the servo saver. To finish off stage 66, you can fit the main drive belt, and this is fitted under this pulley here, and it goes to this pulley here underneath this tensioner. To make it a bit easier, you can loosen the screws holding this intermediate drive shaft in place, or you can remove and loosen this receiver box. So just slot the drive belt into the gap there, and then fit it around the pulley on the rear. And then place the top of the drive belt underneath the tensioner, like this. That's how it should look. Then retighten the screws that you've loosened underneath the drive shaft, and that will complete stage 66.